My name is Joey Hanna. I am the executive director here at the Utah Parent Center. And I am so pleased to have with us today my good friend and colleague, Dr. Matthew Woppett. He is here and ready to provide us with his awesome presentation. Matthew is a super good friend of the Utah Parent Center and a huge advocate for people with disabilities in the state of Utah and across the country. And Matthew is the executive director of, let me see if I can get this right, the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. And just a plug from the Parent Center about the Institute. They are our state's organization that is really in charge of doing research and advising policymakers on a lot of the issues that impact us and our families. And so if you don't already follow the Institute on social media, I highly recommend that you do. They have a lot of good information that they send out, but maybe more importantly, there's oftentimes research initiatives that USU is conducting that really inform policymakers about the issues that face our families. And so I would highly recommend that you follow them and participate in their research studies when necessary or when they're available, because of course, the policies can only be developed in programs and things based on the good amount of good actual research that reflect our families, including my own. All of us here, as you know, are parents of people with disabilities here at the Utah Parent Center, and that includes myself. I have a 16-year-old son with autism spectrum disorder. So without any further ado, I would love to invite you, Matt, to take it away. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. And I know I didn't give a huge overview. I know your bio is available on the website, but anything else you'd like to share, I thought I'd leave that up to you.
Okay, I can do that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear. I can hear you.
Perfect. Then I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. Can everybody see that now too? Okay. Let me just got to make one tweak here and make sure that I can see you. That's the like to make sure I can see the folks I'm talking to. So yeah, thanks, Joey. I'm excited to be here. I'm a little bit nervous because this is a topic I'm super passionate about, and this is a topic that I could talk about ad nauseum. So I'm going to try not to do that today, and to hopefully give you a few key takeaways. I do need to warn you, I am an academic and I am a professor, and so I tend to profess, and so I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum here. But once I get rolling, especially on Zoom, I can get rolling. If there's questions or anything else, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm going to try to leave room at the end here also to answer questions. So as Joey said, I'll do a quick little intro. As Joey said, I'm the executive director of the USU Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice. I also teach in the College of Education here. And I've been off and on here in Utah. I got all 3 degrees, my bachelor's, master's, and my PhD at the University of Utah. And then I left for a while and worked in Alaska and Idaho, and now I'm back to Utah. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. I've been here for 5 years, and anyway, hopefully I have some lessons that will be useful. I should note that when I was here in Utah doing my master's and PhD work, it was on inclusion way back in the early 90s, and that hasn't changed, although the focus has become a little bit different. So today I want to weave together a few stories, and as I was trying to pull my thoughts together into what I think is hopefully a coherent presentation, I recognize that there's some intersecting stories that we need to acknowledge when we're talking about inclusion and belonging. Those are inclusion, of course, that is the topic, right? but we also need to consider the nature of disability, because when we talk about inclusion, there's inclusion as it's discussed with diversity initiatives, and then there's the inclusion that we frequently talk about with disability, and for some reason they sometimes tend to be two different things. So we're going to talk a bit about diversity. We're going to talk a little bit about disparities and measuring disparities. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about design and how do we design for belongings? What are some key principles to help people feel like they belong? So that's where we're going. Let's see how well we can do. I'm not a great storyteller, but we're going to try this. So let's start with inclusion. When we talk about inclusion and going back to the very beginning, and if we're talking about education, because a lot of times especially in the disability world, we're talking about inclusion in public schools. So if we go all the way back to the very beginning of that with the Regular Education Initiative in the 1980s, we often find that what's being written and what's being talked about is something that we do for others. We include others. We include people with disabilities. We include people from different racial, ethnic, linguistic backgrounds. And it's often rooted in ideas and frameworks about diversity and social justice, and in our world, disability rights. But I want to make the argument today that that's a wrong way to think about inclusion. If we think about inclusion as something that we do for others, even whether, and it doesn't matter which side of that equation we're on, whether we're on the majority that's trying to be inclusive or whether we're in the minority that's trying to be included. If we think about it as something that someone else has to do, then it relieves us of any responsibility. And so I really want to argue today that inclusion and belonging are important for everybody, not just some abstract other. Now, in order to really understand inclusion, we need to talk about exclusion for a second. At some point in our lives, we've all been outsiders. I want you to think about a point in your life when you were an outsider, when you were excluded. For some people, this is very easy. For other people, especially if you happen to come from more of a majority culture, you may have more of a challenge thinking about a time where you felt excluded. But try to bring something up in your mind and try to pay attention to how you felt in that scenario. We usually can pick these out pretty easily because they tend to be uncomfortable. When we feel excluded, it tends to feel awkward, tends to feel lonely, tends to feel isolating. It's unnatural. It's not how we want to feel. It's actually stressful. And although I'm not going to go into the psychological aspects of exclusion today, and we could do that because being excluded has significant psychological implications, it actually causes our body to be stressed out and the stress response to turn on, and that causes a whole host of things to occur. But really today, what we want to pay attention to is the fact that when we are excluded, it's not how we want to feel. We want to feel included. Everybody wants to feel like they fit in. Unfortunately, as humans, we don't do this naturally. We have created exclusive classes, clubs, groups, organizations, whatever the case may be. But the fact is that nobody's born into an exclusive club or a class. We put people in these positions, right? Even seemingly concrete categories, when we look at the world around us, like race, ability, gender, social class, religion, are all socially constructed. They're ideas that somebody decided were important, and we use those ideas to make a distinction. But they seem concrete to us. They seem real to us because we've reified them. And when we reify something, it means we treat an abstract concept like a concrete thing, like it actually exists. But if we get down to the very root of it, these things, race, ability, language, social class, yes, there's difference, but are they real differences? Well, no, Not really. Somebody's decided that they're real and that they're important, but in the long run, they really aren't. But the important thing to realize here is because we can do this, because as humans we can create separate categories and classes, it means that we can also create inclusive categories and classes. So if we can create exclusive spaces, exclusive classrooms, exclusive clubs, exclusive groups, then it must also mean that we can do the converse. It must mean that we can create inclusive categories. We can create inclusive classes, inclusive spaces, inclusive places. We don't have to be exclusive. And that's something that I think we frequently overlook. Unfortunately, being humans, we don't do this very well. As humans, we have a tendency to think in terms of us versus them. We create our social context, but we're really, really bad at it. We have a tendency to categorize and sort people, and we do this in a very binary sort of way. We do it conservative versus liberal. We do it white collar versus blue collar. We do it black versus white, majority, minority, right? Male, female, able, disabled, us versus them. That's natural to us. And unfortunately, although we have the ability to do more gradations, we tend to always narrow it down, especially here in the United States, to these binary distinctions. But the criteria that we use to sort people are based upon arbitrary values. Color. Color isn't black and white, colored versus not colored. There's a whole spectrum. Language. Language isn't English and non-English. There's a whole spectrum of languages, but here in the US, we've kind of made some pretty binary distinctions here. Religion, Christian versus non-Christian. Ability, you can or you can't, right? But they're arbitrary values. It's something that we've assigned. And again, it's something that we're very good. We're very good at creating distinctions and categorizing. It's a little more difficult for us to remove those distinctions. So we naturally think in terms of like us and not like us. And we prefer to be with people who are like us. But on that note, as we think about this, and as you think about this, this is very much at the core of a lot of the diversity stuff that's going on in our country today. But I want to make the argument that disability is a little bit different. So you're going to notice the term arbitrary in here a lot. I talked about the arbitrary of nature of inside and outside, the arbitrary values that we create distinctions based on. I want to talk now about the arbitrary nature of ability. Although Western philosophy would argue that humans are rational, our cultural attitudes towards disability indicate otherwise. We continue to see disability as the exception to the norm, something that is atypical and uncommon. Nevertheless, besides birth and death, disability is probably the most common aspect of the human experience. In spite of current debates about the fluidity of identity, I can't go out and join most minority groups. I can't go out and choose to become African American or Asian or Latinx, right? But I can acquire a disability at any point, and that could change.
Okay, so honestly, I'm sorry. Sometimes I feel like I don't know.
Trying to see. Someone have a question there?
I think we got him muted, Matt.
Oh, okay, perfect. I got to figure out where I was there. It's almost assured that all of us will acquire a disability at some point in our lives, either through accident or aging. Therefore, the civil rights and legal protections that we have tried to put in place for people who are disabled are not for some abstract minority group, or not for some other out there that needs our charity and support. The disability rights, the protections, the talk about inclusion that we fight for and defend are all for us. In fact, thinking otherwise and thinking that somehow we're invincible and this is not going to be us at some point is irrational. And contrary to the nature of life as we know it, we're all just temporarily able-bodied, and we are all going to join this minority group at some point. It could be temporary. You could break a leg or an arm, and that could compromise you temporarily. It could be permanent. It could be a spinal cord injury. It could be a disease. It could be long COVID. Whatever the case may be, it's a group that we all belong to. So the problem of ableism isn't just a matter of discrimination against a specific other group. Ableism is a set of attitudes and actions that disadvantage all of us. One of the stories that I like to tell is about one of my friends in Idaho who was a lawyer. He was in Boise, in downtown Boise. He had a law office in one of the old historic buildings down there. And there were, anyway, he got into a fight around accessibility in his building. Because he was a lawyer, he didn't like being told what to do, fought against putting ramps and elevators in to make his office accessible because he did, number one, he felt like it would compromise the historic nature of the building. And number two, he didn't feel like it was important. Really, he literally said, I don't have any disabled clients. Well, unfortunately, this friend was out riding his bike a few years ago out in Meridian, was coming around a corner, a car ran a stoplight and hit him, and he ended up with severe injuries. He ended up having to go through spinal cord rehabilitation, and in spite of, over a year and a half of rehabilitation, continues to use a wheelchair. Now, the ironic thing is that although he was able to go back to work as a lawyer, because it didn't really impact his cognitive functioning, the accident itself, he was unable to get into his office. Why? Because he had felt like those accommodations that were required under the ADA that people were wanting him to put in were not something, he didn't have anybody like that. It didn't apply to him. And all of a sudden, he's ready to go back to work and he can't get in the front door of his office. He can't use the bathroom. He can't get into his desk. He can't get his materials, right? Because he assumed that these changes were for some abstract other, instead of realizing that these accommodations and these practices that we put in place are actually for all of us. So we're going to come back to this idea as we go through here. So disability is often left out of broader conversations about diversity and inclusion. And part of this is because the assumption is that diversity is about difference, and that disability is a medical deficit or a biological phenomenon. And again, if you think diversity is like, oh, they're different. But with disability, it's like, oh, something's wrong with them. But just like any other aspect of diversity, disability impacts a person's identity and how society interacts with them. Therefore, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equity, it's really, really important that we include disability in those conversations. We've noticed, and we know this over the past 25 years of research, that when a person has even multiple markers of difference, including a disability, and then they come from a racial minority, a linguistic minority, or have other markers of difference, that they can be doubly or triply disadvantaged. In fact, as those markers of difference add up, a person feels more and more excluded and has fewer and fewer opportunities as they go through life. Now, why do I bring this up? There's a lot of places we could go with that. I wanted to bring that up because it's important to point out that we've constructed disability, and we've constructed an ableist society using our thinking. Our us versus them. We have valued ability over disability. We have valued using steps and walking into buildings and using your hand to open a door and all these things, but it doesn't have to be this way. Now, we know this, we have made change. Society has evolved. Disability, this is another thing to consider as we think about inclusion. Disability has not changed. The fundamental nature of disability is the same. A child who was born with Down syndrome in the 1480s has exactly the same genetic and chromosomal attributes as a child born with Down syndrome yesterday. A person who lost an arm in the Civil War has the same physical attributes as a person who loses his arm today. Disability has not changed, but what has changed is our attitudes and our response towards it. And we have made progress. If we look back on the history of disability from the 1600s all the way through the mid 20th century, well, actually through the 1980s, the majority of people with disabilities were excluded from society. They were institutionalized, they were locked away. We didn't see them. They weren't part of our communities. They weren't part of our schools. They weren't included in our classrooms. So we have made changes. Our attitudes have evolved. And as our attitudes have evolved, our behaviors have changed and we have made progress. We've proven that we can do better, but I don't think that we're done yet. We're not quite there. And here's your, we'll see. So clearly we have more to do. So I don't know how many of you have seen this picture. This is the Wheelchair Foundation in California where they have steps going up to it. They actually, if you look at this, they do have ramps, but you have to go in the back. But yeah, just to show you how deeply entrenched our attitudes are about ableism right there. Anyway, okay. So let's talk a little bit about inclusion. So although we've made progress, inclusion is a term that has lost much of its impact in recent years because a lot of people have equated inclusion with integration or with least restrictive environment. Too many people have equated inclusion with equal access and not equitable outcomes. So if we look at the laws right now, the ADA requires integration. IDEA requires least restrictive environment. These concepts leave a lot of wiggle room in their interpretation and how they're applied within our communities and schools. Even the dictionary definition from the Oxford English Dictionary of inclusion leaves a whole lot to be desired. The Oxford English Dictionary says the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or mental disabilities and members of other minority groups. So really what's ended up happening is that equal access and inclusion has come to mean a place instead of a set of behaviors, policies, practices that facilitate belonging. I've sat in many classrooms where we've gone to schools and these schools have said, we're inclusive. And I go sit in a math class and a student with a disability is sitting in the math class in the back of the classroom with a paraprofessional, but is not necessarily involved in the activities or the learning that's going on in that classroom. So including a student in math class, placing them there, doesn't necessarily mean that that student will succeed in math. They may need additional supports to fully take advantage of the ability to access of the placement. Fair hiring practices, treating all candidates equally, giving them equal access to opportunities for employment doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hire different or diverse candidates. As a result of our unconscious and implicit bias, including women on your leadership team or within your management structure doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be compensated equally. And in fact, some of the work that we do here at USU, we work with the Women's Leadership Project in the business school here. And we look at this, and in Utah, right, the gender pay gap is 36% between men and women who are in similar positions as men. So just including women there doesn't necessarily mean that they have access to the same opportunities. They're included, they're in the place, but they're not necessarily included. They don't feel like they belong. Having a diverse workforce, diverse classroom, a diverse team doesn't necessarily mean that people feel like they belong. Now, I do want to be clear that place is important. Place matters. Just changing where people are located has significantly increased life expectancy for adults with disabilities. If we go back to the era, the 60s and 70s here in the United States, when the majority of adults with disabilities were institutionalized, life expectancy at the best was 35 to 45 years. Just closing down institutions moving people into the community, giving them opportunities to live, learn, work, and play with their peers, with their families, with their friends, has increased life expectancy for adults with disabilities, almost doubled it, 65 to 75 years. So over the past 50 years, as we've been working for greater access, we have made an impact. So place matters. And I keep going back to this. It's really important to note that we're making progress. We're slowly getting there, but we have more to do. So going back to the idea about equal access, though, with inclusion, just because a student has equal access, or just because an individual has equal access, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to equal outcomes. Health disparities research has actually shown us that excluded individuals need much more than an equal opportunity. They need additional supports to take advantage of those opportunities. Inclusion, like our us versus them thinking, is often considered to be binary, right? You're in or you're out. And inclusion is something that has kind of become a word, I think, that has lost, like I said, a lot of its meaning. We say somebody's included or they're not included, when really there's a whole continuum there. And really what we should be looking at is belonging. It's hard to define and measure inclusion. It either you are or you're not, but it is possible to evaluate, define, and measure belonging. And I want to show you how we do that. So we're going to take a quick quiz here, and you can put your answer in the chat box if you want. Some of you may know this. I like to do this frequently. And again, this is going to reinforce some of what I've covered up to this point, but also lay a context for where we're going. So, oh, dang it. My animations didn't work. This is supposed to be animated, so just the question comes up on top and you don't see the information underneath. Something happened there. Well, now you see the answers. I'm sorry. So there you go. What is the largest minority group in the United States? Well, as you can see, it's people with disabilities. Approximately 19%, 20% of the US population qualifies as having a disability, and it's growing as a result of our medical technology, a rapidly aging population, greater survival from war-related injury. And we've been at war for 20 years, and we're still kind of there. And traumas, and again, we've increased survivability, but it has meant that the level of disability in our country has increased significantly. So with that said, this isn't going to work because the next slide is going to bring up the answers as well. So we're just going to go with it. Let's see. So which minority group has the highest poverty rate in the United States? Well, as you can probably imagine and see here, it's people with disabilities. 31% of people with disabilities live below the poverty level and struggle with attendant disparities in health and mental health as a result of that. The poverty rate in the US as a whole in 2018 was 11.8%. So the poverty rate for individuals with disabilities is triple that. Among racial and ethnic groups, because we often like to think that racial and ethnic groups struggle with more poverty, which is actually not true. If we look at American Indians and Alaska Natives, they had the highest poverty rate among racial and ethnic groups at 26%. African Americans at 21%, Hispanic, Latinx at 18%, Asian Pacific Islanders at 10%, and then whites at 8.1% in terms of poverty. People with disabilities far outstrip any of those in terms of where they're living and their quality of life. Now, the last one, which minority group in the United States has the highest unemployment rate? Well, as you can imagine, it's people with disabilities. In fact, conservative estimates place the unemployment rate for people with disabilities at between 37 to 40%. The unemployment rate for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities is closer to 75%. It's interesting to note that this rate would be unacceptable for any other minority group in the United States, but we seem to just accept it as, oh, they can't work, or they don't want to work, or their benefits keep them from working. And so people just seem to accept the fact that people with disabilities don't work. When the fact of the matter is that it's really an indication of a crisis of creativity within the employment sector, and a lack of employers to really think in a meaningful way about how they can create more diverse and inclusive workforces. So why do I bring this up? Well, I bring this up because I want to point out the disparities and how we measure these disparities. Let's see, there we go. So what are the real world results of this poverty that people with disabilities live in? Well, if we look at the research over the past year even, residents of impoverished neighborhoods or communities are at increased risk for mental illness, chronic disease, higher mortality, lower life expectancy. Some population groups living in poverty may have more adverse health outcomes than others. For example, the risk of chronic conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity is higher among those with the lowest income and education. In addition, older adults who are poor experience higher rates of disability and mortality. In fact, in many cases, the disability and poverty issue is a chicken or the egg scenario. Is it the disability that causes the poverty, or is it poverty that causes disability? There's evidence to point both ways there. But the most important thing is that people with disabilities are more vulnerable to these effects of poverty than other groups. And so we can measure the effects of this exclusion. When we look at people with disabilities being excluded from our communities, from our workplaces, what are the results of that? The results of that is literally that they are less physically and mentally healthy than other groups in this country. A lot of people say, oh yeah, well, that's the same for other groups, and income's not really that, people with disabilities have access to Medicaid and to other services. Well, if we look at other studies that address that issue, we see that income and health are directly correlated once you remove all these other factors. Health, both physical and mental health, and longevity are directly correlated with income and social class. In fact, income is the driving force behind the striking health disparities that most minorities experience here in this country. If we look at how this looks, middle-class Americans are healthier than those living at or near poverty. But if we even go above that, even wealthy Americans are less healthy than the wealthiest of Americans. As you go down the income ladder, you find worse and worse health outcomes, and you find shorter and shorter life expectancy. Even when we look among minority groups, so if we look at the Black population here in the United States, or the Hispanic Latinx population here in the United States, more wealthy Blacks are healthier than less wealthy Blacks. More wealthy Hispanic Latinx are more healthy than less wealthy. So really what we see is that the differences, racial, linguistic, whatever we want to say, are, as it says here, dwarfed by the disparities identified between the high and low income economic groups. So although I could dive in there, the question is, why do I bring this up? So what does this fact that disability is the largest minority, and they're living in poverty, and they have the lowest income level, and as a result of that, they're less healthy? Well, I bring it up because it indicates that we can measure the impact of whether you belong. We can measure the direct impact of whether you are participating and belong in society. In the United States, one of the greatest measures of belonging is your job. When you're going to school, think about this. When you're going to school, you're a student, and people don't really, that is your identity. When you get into college, what is the one thing that people ask you? What's your major? Why? Because your major becomes your identity. Once you've graduated from college and you're meeting new people on the street, or you're meeting new people in professional scenarios, what is one of the first things people ask? What do you do? Right? what do you say when you don't work, right? Some of you may be in that situation. I know that my wife she worked professionally for many years and then took time off to be a mother for our kids. And it was a very sensitive subject for her when people would say, well, what do you do? And she's like, I'm a mom, right? We define people by their employment, by what they do. And when you're not employed and when you're not able to participate in that system, you feel excluded. And as a result of that, you don't just feel excluded, you make less money. And as a result of making less money, you have attendant health issues. And as a result of the attendant health issues, you have lower life expectancy. There are real physical implications. So what? Well, what this shows us is that social context matters. The communities, the neighborhoods, the schools, and the workplaces where we live, learn, work, and play have a direct impact on our health and well-being. If you feel like you fit, you are healthier and you are happier. If you feel like you don't fit or that you don't have a place, you are less healthy and you are less happy. So what does this have to do with belonging? You're like, okay, I came here to talk about belonging. So hopefully I'm tying some of these strands together. So what about belonging? We all as human beings have a primal need to belong. It makes us feel safe. It's fundamental to our sense of happiness and well-being. People who report greater belonging, they live longer, they're happier, they have more balanced mental health, they are more productive. People who report feeling isolated, lonely, excluded are less happy, and they struggle with learning, they have lower immune function, they tend to be less healthy. This is all caused by what's called the social buffering hypothesis. This is actually research that's gone on for many years, where it's actually terrible research, where they take animals and they isolate them. So they take group animals, herd animals, and whether it's a monkey that they remove from their family group, or whether it's a rat that they take away, whatever the case may be, we find that individuals who are isolated and alone tend to feel more stressed out and tend to not feel as safe. And as a result, they have all these health and immune issues that go along with it. A great example of this, I don't know how many of you get National Geographic. The most recent issue of National Geographic that just came out a couple of weeks ago is all about the power of touch. And a lot of the science and the articles in there are all about the importance of physical connection with other people, belonging, feeling like you have somebody who cares for you. This is why herd animals live in herds. I have the pictures of the zebras here. When a zebra is alone and isolated away from the herd, that zebra is more edgy. That zebra is less safe. That zebra is more on alert. And if we take the blood, which biologists have done, that zebra's stress response is turned on permanently. When a zebra is together with its group, the zebra is more relaxed. The zebra feels, well, we can't ask a zebra if it feels safer, but what we can do is we can take that zebra's blood and we can look at levels of cortisol and adrenaline and other things. And what you see within social animals is that when they're together, they have lower levels of cortisol and adrenaline. We can literally measure the impact of being together. And that social buffering hypothesis is really important. Being together with other people like us, where we belong, makes us feel safe. Some of the most terrible research on this is actually done on rats. They've been doing 20 years of research on social isolation in rats. And what they do is they take these rats and they take them, they're born, they take them immediately away from their mother, they're fed by a mechanical hand and they grow up alone. And then they have other rats that they leave together with their family group in a social setting like the picture there. And what they found over 20 years of research, both cognitive and physical, is that rats who are socially isolated, who are not together with other rats, they tend to be more neurotic. They perform more slowly on physical and cognitive tasks. They perform less accurately on learning tasks. They have lower life expectancies. They heal more slowly from injuries, and they are more prone to infections. Now, I won't go into a whole lot of detail here because a lot of people get really queasy about this research. But it's really important to note that over the past 20 years, what a lot of this research, particularly on rats, has shown is that when you are alone and isolated, you are less physically and mentally healthy. Therefore, it's really important for us to feel connected. But the question is, okay, that's rats. What about humans? Can we measure this in humans? Yes. Recently, we have started doing this research on belonging in humans. So if we go back, decades of research here in the United States has shown that even the most prepared college students from minority communities have worse grades and health outcomes than their attendant white classmates. So in 2011, a Stanford social psychologist, Greg Walton, designed a study that he has replicated multiple times since then, that demonstrated that an intentional belonging intervention could improve minority students' health and their academic achievement, right? Going back to the rats, what is it they struggle with when they're socially isolated? Learning, cognitive tasks, and their physical health. Same thing in humans. So again, it's a group of African-American students who are attending a predominantly white university in the Northeastern United States. One group was assigned to a belonging condition where they met with other classmates and understood, and other classmates talked about their insecurities and talked about their fears. And then another group was in another condition where really what was highlighted was achievement, right? Who's doing better? And of course, it was always the white students who were doing better. Anyway, we're not going to go into the details here, but let's just say the belonging condition, the African-American students who were in that earned higher grades over the course of their 4 years in college, while the other participants in the other group, the non-belonging intervention, actually maintained the same GPA. By the senior year, the gap between the African-American and the European-American students' GPAs had closed by 79%. And they also reported fewer health issues, fewer trips to the doctors than students in the control condition. Now, interestingly, Greg Walton has followed up with these students 15 years. And what he's doing the 15-year follow-up here. I was just reading an interview with him. He's getting ready to launch it. And these results are durable. They continue. These students have continued to thrive. These students have continued to feel like they are part of something bigger. And as a result, they are healthier and they are performing better academically. Okay, so what else? What are the other real world impacts of belonging? Well, other studies have demonstrated that interactions with sexist men in classrooms or work environments cause women's performance to drop. These similar studies show that women's stress levels go up when they're interacting with sexist men. So again, this is a situation where you don't belong. And if you don't belong, if you feel like your identity or an aspect of your identity causes you to be threatened, it results in you not having the skills that you need to perform at your highest level because you're worried about your safety. And another study, unbalanced representation, when they brought in college freshmen. This is an interesting study. They brought in two groups of college freshmen from minority backgrounds. One group they put through an orientation. In that orientation, they walked around campus and they saw pictures of white people, and they went to a wall of fame, and it was all the presidents of the university and the distinguished professors. And they were all old white men. And they watched an orientation video that was all white students. And then they had another group that went through where they changed the artwork and they changed the wall of fame to include more diverse faces, more people who looked different. And the video, they created a new orientation video that included more balanced representation of people who looked, talked, acted like the students who were coming in. And what we found is that the people who went through the unbalanced representation study had a lower recall memory. They didn't recall as much. They had a lower sense of belonging, and they were more stressed out by the end. They were more worried about whether they were going to fit or not. Whereas the students who went through the balanced representation tended to report more belonging. They were able to do better on recall tasks, and they tended to have fewer markers of stress. So what this shows us is that aspects of identity, especially aspects of you that are different, can cause us to suffer something called identity threat. And whether that's disability, whether that's skin color, whether that's language, it has a real physical impact on our bodies and on our minds and how we perceive the world around us. We can measure belonging through these indirect measures. So what about positive things? That's the question. What about positive things? Can we do this? Yes. If we look at workplaces that institute belonging interventions, and again, I don't have time to go into the details on these, but we look at workplace study. This is by Global Human Capital Trends Survey, which is a big sort of national survey looking at corporate culture. People who report feeling like they belong in their workplace, they have a 56% increase in job performance, a 50% reduction in employee turnover, 75% decrease in employee sick days, and even a single incidence of micro exclusion in a culture that has facilitated belonging led to a 25% performance decline on a team project for the excluded individual. Again, exclusion and inclusion matter. It's measurable. It is something that is not just nice. Including somebody is genuinely going to impact their physical and mental health. So what does it belong? So inclusion, again, we come to think of it as a place. I like to start thinking of it as belonging. And what does belonging mean? Well, belonging is about more than just inclusion. It's about helping other people feel like insiders instead of outsiders. Belonging sounds like, can a person like me belong and succeed here? In a place that facilitates belonging, you see others who look like you, who communicate like you, and who want to spend time with you voluntarily. You see representations of people like you in textbooks, on the wall, in the videos that are shown, in the media, in curricula, in flyers and posters, whatever it may be, you see people that look like you. This increases belonging. You have role models who look, act, talk, behave like you, who are in leadership roles or in key roles and can provide mentorship for you. In places where belonging occurs, you're treated as a valuable member of the community with something to contribute. Now, I want to make a really quick distinction here because this always comes up. What is the difference between fitting in and belonging? Now, when we talk about inclusion, really what we're often talking about, and especially when we're talking in corporate speak and like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, we're talking about creating a space where people feel like they belong. That's what I've been touching on here. But most of us spend our time trying to fit in, and many of us expect others to make efforts to fit in. The problem is that fitting in places the responsibility and the effort on the individual. The individual has to change and adapt. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. An individual can't change their skin color. An individual can't change whether they speak with an accent or not. An individual can't change their ability status if they have any sort of a disability. Therefore, some people just can't fit in. This is where belonging becomes important. Belonging takes special effort from the community and places less of a burden on the individual. It's the responsibility of the people who create the norms, who create the group environment, who create the corporate culture to create belonging. And we need to, so this doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the effort that people put towards fitting in. We have to acknowledge that because a lot of people expend an immense amount of effort just to fit into our communities. But more importantly, we need to shift the focus to the collective responsibility that we have to take to create spaces that facilitate belonging. Now, real belonging requires a cultural shift on our part. Culture is built by our attitudes, and our attitudes lead to behaviors. In fact, it's actually a scale. What we think and what we feel leads to how we behave, and how we behave creates the cultures in our schools, in our organizations, and in our workplace. It's more difficult to change culture than it is to change an individual's behavior, because changing a culture requires changing multiple people's behavior. In fact, we've shown over and over and over again in interventions that you can put a good person in an unhealthy system, and the system will win 90% of the time. Systems are very, very resistant to change. It requires a very clear fundamental effort at changing attitudes and behaviors of the individuals who create the culture. Therefore, the target of the intervention when we're talking about creating inclusion and belonging needs to be on the inside group, not on the outside group. Not we need to get more different people in here. Really what we need to do is we need to change the inside. We need to make the inside more open and welcoming so that people outside want to come in and want to belong. Unfortunately, within disability particularly, a lot of our focus is on making people fit in. We're trying to give the outsiders the skills they need to fit in or cope. And we're not really changing the environments that we live, learn, work, and play in that make a difference about whether a person feels like they belong or not. So belonging starts with the actions and attitudes of the individuals who are already in that environment. Your job as an insider, and you are all insiders in some setting in your life, your job is to make everybody feel like an insider. In order to do that, in order to create a truly inclusive environment, we have to willingly and proactively accommodate and try to anticipate the needs and the environmental factors that immediately let a person know if they're welcome or not. There's a lot of factors to consider. I don't have time to go into them today, but interpersonal factors, environmental factors, technical factors. Just when somebody walks into a building, what are the different messages that they receive? Anyway, this can be a follow-up. There's actually a whole field of study here on how you create inclusive, open, accessible environments, right? And again, if somebody walks into an office building or to a school and the first thing that they see are faces that don't look like them on the walls and in the office, then they're immediately going to be put on their guard. So we need to be, so it's not just our individual behaviors that we need to think about. We need to think about the external messages that we're sending when people walk into our environments. So I want to make one more important distinction here. Let's see. Okay. When we're thinking about inclusive environments, anytime a person has to request an accommodation or special treatment, it calls attention to their difference. And what this does is it reinforces their sense of being an outsider and not belonging. Unfortunately, this is what we do with disability. Oh, you need to request an accommodation in order to get special treatment. We require people to focus on their difference. We require people to, we constantly remind people of their shortcomings in terms of fitting in with the group. It's actually a privilege if our settings are not constantly calling attention to your identity. But many people from minority groups, from the disability community, are constantly under threat. Their identity is always a threat because people are always judging them. Now, I want to point out that although difference and diversity is important, there are positive and negative ways of calling attention to difference. And we really need to focus more effort on creating spaces where people feel that their differences are acknowledged and accommodated before they have to ask for those changes. Now, I'm almost done here. I want to end by addressing what I call a universal design fallacy. So a lot of times when we go into these things and we talk about creating a more inclusive environment, people are like, well, that's fine, but that's for a small minority, or we don't have people like that here. This is what's called the universal design fallacy. There's a prevailing opinion that creating inclusion and making efforts to accommodate people requires bending over backwards. It requires special effort to meet the unique needs of a small minority of people. Unfortunately, this is a false assumption. The principles of inclusion and universal design affect and benefit everybody. Again, with disability, we are all going to have a disability at some point. A great example is the lever doorknob. The lever doorknob here was developed back in the mid 20th century. It was actually developed not to be used outside of assisted. It was actually developed for older adults with arthritis who were living in older homes Older homes, if you've been in them, know that they had little metal or porcelain doorknobs that were really tiny that you had to be able to grip and turn in order to get into the room. I remember my grandmother lived in downtown Boise, and she had one of these houses with these old tiny doorknobs. The levered doorknob was created as assistive technology to help people with arthritis stay and live within their homes. As you all know, though, the levered doorknob has become universal in all of our homes, in all of our commercial environments, and all of our schools, because it helps everybody. The levered doorknob doesn't require you to use your hand to open the door. You can open a levered doorknob with your elbow, with your knee, with your butt, with whatever you're holding in your hands. The levered doorknob is just more accessible for everybody. It helps everyone. Closed captioning is another great example. Closed captioning used to never be on, and yet closed captioning now is on almost everything. Why? Because many of us have found that closed captioning actually helps us, right? We can watch videos without having the sound and still get the content. Navigational cues, right? I was thinking about this the other day with Siri on my phone. The fact that my map talks to me. Maps didn't used to talk to us. Maps did talk. There was navigational systems for people with visual impairments where you would call and somebody would help you navigate with the map. And we've just integrated that into our phone. And so this technology that was helping people who were blind navigate urban environments is now on all of our phones, and we use it to help us get around. It's an assistive technology that benefits everyone. Therefore, most adaptations, most accommodations, most things that we need to do to create inclusive environments that help people feel like they belong benefit everybody, not just a small minority. Now, I have 1 minute here. So what can you do? Well, I know this has been a presentation full of a lot of big ideas and a lot of intersecting narratives here. What I want to point out, and the 4 take-homes I want you to take with you here, is number 1, I think it's important to recognize that disability is an important, vital aspect of diversity in our communities. And we need to recognize that exclusion has a real, tangible physical effect on people, especially people with disabilities who are living in poverty and who are lacking employment opportunities. Number 2, we need to notice the settings where we're insiders, and we need to evaluate the types of changes that we need to make in order to help everyone feel like an insider. That's your challenge today. What can you do? What's one thing that you can do in your home, in your workplace, in your school, in your classroom, that you can do to make everybody feel more welcome? What's one thing you can do that will call less attention to difference? Number 3 is consider how your attitudes affect your behaviors, examine your implicit and unconscious biases, and proactively work to address them. A lot of our attitudes, again, culture emerges from attitudes, attitudes lead to behavior, behavior leads to culture. In order to change culture, we have to address those attitudes, and many of our attitudes are deeply, deeply embedded unconscious biases, and we need to address those. Finally, proactively provide accommodations and opportunities for people with disabilities. Genuine efforts towards inclusion are beneficial for everybody. So I know that this has been a whirlwind and there's a lot of content here, but I really do want to end by saying our world today requires us to look beyond difference and to strive to understand others if we're serious about creating inclusive communities. Although we can accept and tolerate that which we don't understand, I don't believe that we can be truly compassionate unless we seek to listen and understand those who are different. Difference shouldn't be a threat. Instead, it should be seen as an opportunity, right, to practice and to grow in our love for those who are different. The sociologist and philosopher Erich Fromm observed that love isn't something natural, rather it requires discipline, concentration, patience, faith, and overcoming narcissism. It isn't a feeling, it's a practice. Difference and diversity offer the perfect proving ground for practicing our commitment to creating inclusive communities where everyone belongs. In spite of what we see in the media every single day, it's important that we remain firm in our commitment to the guiding values of inclusion and belonging for people with disabilities. But more importantly, we need to also remember that any infringement or assault on the rights of any specific group is not an assault on an abstract other. It's an assault on the rights for all of us. I'm proud to work with each of you. I'm really honored and humbled at the opportunity I've had to share some of my ideas with you today. I really am just so thrilled that you are here, that you're committed, hopefully, to embracing diversity and to creating inclusive communities. Our commitment to these principles has never been more important than it is today. So I want to thank you for all that you do for our communities and for our schools and for our workplaces and for the efforts that you make to make this a place where everybody feels like they can belong. So there we go. I am done.
So
Thank
great, Matthew. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's been amazing. There are a couple of questions if you have the time in the chat, that if you'd be willing to address them.
Yep, I will. I'm trying to scroll up. Will the
Yeah,
slides
same.
be available? Yes, I will send these slides to Joey and she can send them out.
Yeah, we will have them available on the Utah Parent Center website, as well as the recording of Matt's awesome presentation available on our website as well. It usually takes us a couple of days to edit them just to get it ready to be published on the website, but we will absolutely post them. I saw a question way kind of up in the comments. So it looks like the question was from the Wilkins family. Is there any research on appreciation of differences of abilities and outcomes?
Yes. That's a loaded question. There is research on it, but it is not terribly strong research. What we do see, and I don't know, did Wilkins, I see Wilkins family on there. Did you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, so, I mean, there are a lot of things that you talked about that I don't think I have personal control over, right?
Yeah.
So I have a daughter with disabilities, and I really want her to be in an inclusive environment at her home, at school, wherever she is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't change the nature of her disabilities, and I can try to inform people and help it be a more inclusive environment. But I wonder if one of those things I can do is to help people have an appreciation of her differences and maybe her similarities that might also help her have better outcomes too, right? Because she's got a lot of disparities coming in, and they kind of build on each other, like you said. And I'm just wondering, like, what's the best way to do that,
Yep, no, you're exactly right. And that's a big part of that changing of attitudes. The more that people are exposed to people who are different than them, and actually there is research on sort of this, I don't know what the proper term is, it's escaping me, but really socialization, right? The more that people hang around people who are different and who are diverse, the more likely it is that their attitudes and conversely their behaviors are going to change, because they recognize through that exposure that, oh, these people aren't so different, and oh yes, it is safe, it is okay. And so yeah, and there is actually that research that's done on, oddly enough, animal models as well, where they've looked at, oddly enough, animals don't get along, and they found that they can actually change animals' behavior through what's called exposure therapy, right? Where all of a sudden you recognize, oh, this isn't a threat, this isn't something that I need to be worried about. And so yeah, I do think that appreciation of differences and making sure that people experience diversity is important to changing those attitudes, which is really that foundational element of changing culture. So I hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. That was a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, it looks like there's one more question from Julie Winters. Do you know anyone who does elementary school assemblies to help students learn about disability, inclusion, and belonging?
Not off the top of my head, but I can find, yes, I do. I don't know the names off the top of my head. So yeah.
Yeah, that's something that Julie Winters, if you want to, you can email the Parent Center. We also can provide some information on that. I know we have resources available. We have done some certain similar trainings like that, and we can get some resources together from Matt as well.
Yep.
All right. Are there any questions left for Dr. Wappett before he hopefully goes and grabs a bite to eat, maybe?
I've got my next meeting actually texting me.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I guess we'll let you go, Matthew.
Oh,
I'll see if there are any questions that I can answer, that the Parent Center can answer in the chat. Unless you want to.
I just saw this one pop up. There is a question also, does the university have classes on inclusion and research? And I'm assuming you mean together or separately. So there are classes on inclusion and there are classes on research. I don't know. I don't think actually, unfortunately, there's a lot that combine the two, which is a problem.
All right. And then a comment. So the more we socialize our children with disabilities, the better it is for all in the community.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
That is true. I will second that, Matthew.
Yep. Cool.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining our Matt's presentation today. We appreciate it. Please, if you haven't filled out the survey when it pops up, please do. That helps the Parent Center with making sure that we bring you offerings and trainings and information that's useful, relevant, and timely for all of you. So thank you so much again, Matthew. And the Utah Parent Center sent you a little thank you in the mail, so it should arrive via USPS sometime soon.
You are far too kind. Thank you so much.
Have a really great day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yep.